Friends, it's a great pleasure to be here. It is, in fact, my first visit ever to Finland, so this is very special for me. And I'm grateful for the learning experience both yesterday and also in the chance to speak with various people here, and I hope to continue that. This is a little bit of an experiment. I'm used to speaking spontaneously from the heart about our work to test the things you are interested in. I was asked to prepare some notes which turned into a small written document which has now been made available in English and Finnish. I did sit and prepare it quietly last week. Actually, I was in Scotland at a Quaker meeting at the time, so it was done from the heart. Instead of falling in the gap between half reading it and half extemporizing, I'm going to speak fairly closely to the text. Then you can follow the Finnish translation if you wish. But I want to leave some time, as I usually do, for you to take me where you would like to go in finding out more about the work of the Quaker United Nations Office, or about the United Nations, or about Quaker international work. So please do have some questions ready, and I think we're set up to do a small translation. Now, Marissa will take us further into how Quaker beliefs in the divine God in each person leads to an emphasis in action in what Quakers do. If we believe that the divine is in each person, then that leads us to a testimony, to use the Quaker word in English, of peace building and of looking for social and economic justice. And also that we should try to work with love and to speak and act honestly. There's also a long-standing Quaker tradition, I think it comes originally from the Quaker John Woolman in the 18th century, of living simply without consuming unnecessarily or damaging our environment. And when I started this work with the Quaker United Nations Office 4 years ago, I was intrigued to find out that William Penn, who happens to be buried in the local Quaker meeting in Britain where I first joined, actually was already talking about international relationships in the 17th century, not just as he helped found Pennsylvania, but also talking about a need for the nations of Europe to understand each other. So those of us who work on behalf of Quakers at the United Nations have quite a heavy responsibility in the tradition we take forward. And so the Quaker United Nations Office, QUNO, tries to put those beliefs into action and to basically to strengthen the United Nations in its original charter. And the Charter of the UN is a wonderful document, and if we could keep close to that, then I think much would be achieved. It means that basically QUNO tries to be a supporter of the best in the UN rather than a critic of the things that can go wrong in the UN. I mentioned in the notes that Quakers were already present in the founding of the UN in 1945 in San Francisco. Some credit Quakers with the presence of civil society, of non-government organizations, in what surprisingly was originally conceived as completely an organization among countries. It was felt that countries could come together, governments could come together, and this time succeed in avoiding war in a way that the League of Nations had not. perhaps rather surprising in our present viewpoint that it was thought this could be done entirely by governments without the need for citizens and society in general. And I mentioned the League of Nations. When in Geneva we want to be presumptuous in Geneva society, we say, oh, there were Quaker representatives here from the 1920s. And in fact, the Quaker directors there had a house where people were brought together to find common understanding. And that was also the model for the Quaker United Nations office. There was a director's house, and it wasn't until 1973, in our case, that actually a Quaker house was established as an office as well as a meeting place. I mentioned in the notes that QNO was established separately in Geneva and New York in 1948, and the Friends World Committee for Consultation, FWCC, that's the worldwide umbrella body of Quakers, was a parent of both QNO Geneva and QNO New York. And Marissa will be saying more about Friends World Committee for Consultation. The two different QNO offices had another parent in each case. In New York, the American Friends Service Committee that Sian has just presented. And in Britain, Quaker Peace and Social Witness, actually it was then called Quaker Peace and Service, which was the other parent of QNO Geneva. Those two offices, although strictly separate in their governance arrangements, now work very closely together, both in terms of staff and governing committees. These days, QNO Geneva is actually established as a Swiss charitable organization, a Swiss not-for-profit organization. Through FWCC, QNO has official observer status in various parts of the UN. Perhaps you're aware that there is not one UN, and when people say, why doesn't the UN do something about this? Why doesn't the UN do something about Syria? There are two difficulties with that. One is that this is the UN today, and please don't give me an exam on this because I can only find my way around about half of this. A very complex structure. Copies downstairs if you're interested. The other, perhaps more important feature beyond the complexity of the UN is that the UN can only really do what the member states permit it to do. The different bodies in the UN are run typically by secretariats that act with very limited powers under the permission of the governments that constituted them. Coming back to QNO, there are many NGOs, non-government organizations, that have observer status at the United Nations. Again, that is a rather simple statement. Actually, we have to have observer status in many different parts, and those are often obtained in separate ways. But let's stick with the generalization. About 3,000 NGOs at the UN. QNO is one of the 130 ones that have something called general consultative status. That means that we're seen as specialists in a number of different issues and in a wide range of countries, based, of course, on the fact that through FWCC, we represent Quakers worldwide, and Quakers are present in many countries. And that official status means that we can make oral and written statements in various parts of the UN. But actually, that's just a small part of our work. And what makes us particularly unique is the efforts building on Quaker testimonies of listening, of hearing everybody's truth, of the divine in each person, our special effort is to bring people together, typically within our Quaker houses in Geneva or New York, for people to listen to each other, to build understanding as human beings connecting together, even on the most difficult international issues that we face today. This builds very much on the idea that much can be achieved through small groups, even when a United Nations agreement is an agreement among, and depending on the treaty, maybe up to 190-something states. Differences, movements, agreements still have to start from small groups of people. Those small groups, in our case, can be diplomats, perhaps the group of diplomats that want to make progress on an issue. Sometimes it's United Nations staff, sometimes it's other NGOs, other non-government organizations. We set up meetings, typically within our Quaker houses, to get people to listen to each other. We have a few simple ground rules. We ask people to listen carefully, perhaps to leave some quiet space between what one person says and another person says. And usually we do this at a meal, lunch or dinner, sometimes coffee. Sometimes it might be as few as 3 people, sometimes it might be as many as 25. And what actually happens in those meetings is very varied according to what the situation is. And typically we don't have a set plan that first meeting will lead to second meeting, will lead to third meeting. Instead, we see how a discussion develops and are ready to move in a number of different directions depending what is coming out of the meeting with diplomats, with UN staff, with NGOs. That means that occasionally a meeting really does get into the very difficult issues of the different positions of states, of different countries, and perhaps provide the opportunity for people to really seek for a solution. You might occasionally hear a country say, suppose we were able to talk in this way, what might the reaction of other countries in this meeting be? But that's rather unusual. Perhaps we'd be working on the detailed wording of a document. My colleague, Rachel Brett, who's just recently retired, worked for 22 years on issues of human rights. She was the go-to person, the expert, whose advice was sought out about the wording in particular treaties. So although you'll never see it written anywhere, there is wording in UN treaties. There are paragraphs that actually started life in a quiet meeting in Quaker House in New York or Geneva. Sometimes something completely unexpected comes out of a meeting. I probably don't have to explain that to Quakers who are used to what happens in a Quaker business meeting when it's going well. And so something comes that leads to a completely different direction from what was expected. I mentioned that I've been at CUNO for 4 years. I came with some experience of international work, and I'm still astonished how just having a house, a place to invite people, some background research makes a difference. If you come into Quaker House in Geneva, there is no reception. It doesn't feel like an office. You actually come in past the kitchen, and you might even be invited to sit in the kitchen. You'll certainly, if you're part of a bigger group, come to our dining room, which can seat up to 14 people. Actually, it's an office. Nobody lives there now. Program assistants used to live right at the top of the building. But although it's an office, the Quaker meeting for worship is held downstairs every week. And of course, over the years, the positive agreements that have been made there seem to give the building some energy. And I think that perhaps QNO New York would say the same thing. And we even find that our diplomat guests have picked this up. Rachel quotes the case of, it was actually a visiting NGO representative who was being a little bit aggressive with one of the diplomats present. And it was another diplomat who stepped in and said, "We don't talk to each other like that here in Quaker House." So I mentioned in the notes that it's almost as though sharing food together, listening carefully, can we call it mystical? It seemed, I wouldn't speak like that in front of diplomats, but I think people sense that we're connecting at a different level. So when people say to us, you Quakers are pretty unique among the 3,000 NGOs at the UN, I think that's probably what they're referring to, a different way of finding human connections. What does this mean in practice? I mentioned in the notes that Quaker House Geneva was the starting point for agreements about child soldiers, about limiting the participation of young people in warfare, whether declared or undeclared, about banning landmines, about the trade agreements that led to the development of and permission to use generic medicines within the World Trade Organization rules against such diseases as AIDS, for example. There's also been a whole body of work done around the rights of women prisoners that led later into work on children of prisoners, about which I'll say more. At Quaker House New York, there was a whole range of different work. A lot of work over 20 years ago that led to the agreements around the Earth Summit in Rio, which is, of course, of great importance in the work being done now on climate change. Work that contributed to reconciliation and progress in Burma, also called Myanmar. And very recently, our colleagues in New York have been working with this huge body of work on the Sustainable Development Goals to ensure that the need for peaceful societies remained in there. In the Millennium Development Goals, countries that were in conflict or emerging from violent conflict, there are about 40 of them in the world, did not achieve a single Millennium Development Goal. And fortunately, this has now been recognized in these very broad but very promising Sustainable Development Goals. Peaceful societies is in there as goal number 16, and the work of our colleagues in New York was key to that. I want to refer to the publications that are available. This is our general publication each year. It's about our work in Geneva and New York, about the people who do it, and about the principles behind it. And I do encourage you, please, to take a copy, if you would be at all interested. This is in English, I regret, not yet in Finnish. And one of the reasons I encourage you is that I brought many copies, so please take one. There's a range of other publications with fewer copies available, but still plenty to take, if you wish, copies to each of the main bases of Quaker meetings within Finland. And one of which we have more copies is rather different from what we usually publish. This is about individual Quaker efforts to face up to climate change, what Quakers around the world are doing. Now, although I may have made it sound so far, speaking of bringing people together, having meals together, believing in peace and justice as though we're some sort of rather pleasant facilitator. Actually, we don't get involved in issues except where there is our own research or the research of others to build on. We have to be somewhat expert on the issues we work on. This has a very practical reason. I mentioned in the text that there was a particular country, there were more than one, where when my colleagues started work many years ago on child soldiers, the diplomats said, "This is a great issue, we're so glad you're working on it. Of course it doesn't bother us because we don't have any child soldiers." And it was a year later that my colleagues were able to say, "Actually, you do." And that, given the positive attitude of that country, led to them being a major participant in the work to reduce the participation of child soldiers. There's this Quaker idea about seeing the seeds of war and injustice in our own actions. And in QNO, this leads us, although we have a number of separate programs, to try to work very firmly on the connections between the different programs, on human rights, on food, on climate change, on peace building. And through this, we hope that we can reduce the tendency of the United Nations to be less effective because everything is divided into all these compartments. I don't want to minimize the difficulty of linking things together, but of course, as you're well aware, the problems, the challenges, the opportunities in our societies, I think Sian showed this in her presentation, it's all linked together. And in the same way, if we want to make a difference at the United Nations, we have to be aware of those links. Based on that, you might think that that gives us a license in our small institution to work on everything. In fact, we try to use our resources rather carefully. We work on issues of importance to Quakers, but we usually work on difficult issues that need long-term commitment and which others are not able to work on because they don't have the financial support or for other reasons. We need to look for areas where we can get the specialist knowledge or where we have it already, and typically where the players are present in Geneva or New York. So a recent example which fulfills some of these, but not all, is our work on climate change, looking at it not primarily as an environmental issue or even as an issue of economic justice, although those are there, but as an issue of peace and of social justice for less fortunate countries in the world and for the less fortunate people within countries, even prosperous countries. It was our governing committee that, on the basis of exploratory work we'd done, and this is what I love about working with Quakers, that said, we do not see exactly where this work will take you, but we feel like you, the staff, strongly called to take this forward. Please go ahead for the next couple of years, see where it leads. And that was in turn based on Quakers and others telling us, you Quakers are good at dealing with difficult problems in negotiations. Climate change seems to be a problem. The negotiations are stuck. Please see what you can do. And we said, there are just a few of us. There are thousands of people at the negotiations. What can we do? But we were led forward. And so these days, we, in each of the preparatory meetings for the climate change discussions at the UN, we hold at least one off-the-record quiet diplomacy dinner, bringing together 10 to 20 negotiators. We now have people from all negotiating blocs and there are about 12 of them, coming to the dinners and listening to each other. And we still ask, is this really of any use? The problems are very big, and they say, the Quaker dinner is now on our timetable. We have all sorts of competing meetings, but we really try not to miss the Quaker dinner. Keep going. So we keep going. The area of human rights has been very important. And the interesting thing that's happening these days is that human rights seems to be getting into everything. So perhaps because the Human Rights Council has been quite successful in Geneva at the UN, we now see things like the right to be protected from climate change, the right to a safe environment, and rights to participation, for example, around the sharing of land and water. So this is very much helping us to connect our work together. I also mention how the work that started on women prisoners has grown into looking at children of prisoners, both male and female prisoners, but from the point of view of the children's needs, and how that went further into the needs of children of parents sentenced to death or executed. A very grim subject. Fortunately, only a minority of the children of prisoners, but with such devastating results in families and in future generations that one would say, how could societies ever have conceived that capital punishment was in any way a solution? And so although we don't work directly on the death penalty, actually, of course, this is a very interesting way of opening up the issue. And we now have at the United Nations states that argue strongly for their right to retain the death penalty, who are nonetheless signatories to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, using very conciliatory language about the need to protect the rights of that group of children. In food security, we have a special focus on the needs and possibilities of small-scale farmers. But this is not about small-scale farmers as a sort of endangered species that we need to protect for human rights reasons, although that's, of course, present, but instead small farmers as innovators who work in marginal conditions and who have major contributions to make to the food security of all of us, even in developed countries. And so to protect the ability of the small farmers to contribute, to innovate, we look particularly at how trade rules and intellectual property rules can interfere. And that's a lot of the work we do at the moment in that area. I want to mention young people. Sian has mentioned in a very moving way. In our own work at CUNO, we have a couple of particular routes. Every year we have 2 or 3 program assistants in Geneva and usually 2 in New York. They're young people, young professionals who join us for a year to be totally part of the team, and they make a great contribution. And also every year in Geneva we have a Geneva summer school where about 25 young people, 20 to 26 in age, join us to learn about the UN and how CUNO works there. I offered you 2 quotations at the end about the work of small groups, which I think is very much the basis of our work. You have them perhaps in front of you, so I won't read them out now. But I'll stop there, and thank you very much for your attention.